Hello everyone, my name is Rob Murray. Alongside me is my good friend Aidan Rupert, and welcome to episode 17 of the WCHC Sports Podcast, where we discuss the latest news and updates from around the sports world. This week we will recap Week 16 of the NFL season, look ahead to a critical slate of Week 17 games, as well as share our first impressions as the NBA season kicks off. We'll also discuss some recent schedule changes to Holy Cross athletics, namely hockey and basketball. But before we begin, WCHC Sports 88.1 FM has always got you covered on Holy Cross athletics. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page and give us a follow on Instagram at WCHC_sports. Aidan, good to be back. Good to see you again, as always. Kick us off with what Holy Cross athletics is to expect over the coming weeks now that their hockey and basketball schedules have undergone some postponements.
Yeah, Rob, well, good to be back, and figure we might as well just get these changes on the podcast right off the bat. Namely, our foremost storyline in terms of COVID postponements is with Holy Cross men's hockey, as recently there was a press release that the season has been postponed indefinitely, meaning all team activities, whether it's games, practices, etc., they will be postponed due to a positive case within the Tier 1 testing group within the program. So that means that they had an upcoming matchup with AIC as well as Army West Point. Those were for January 2nd and 3rd and January 6th, respectively. So those are going to be postponed for the time being, and potential makeup games will be announced at a later date. Holy Cross men's hockey, they currently sit at 4-4 on the year, with their most recent victory coming with a 4-3 overtime victory over Bentley. That was a couple weeks back. Their most recent matchup was actually an 0-3 loss against Quinnipiac on December 23rd, and they have not played since. Meanwhile, on the women's side of things, they are still slated to have their next matchup should be tomorrow night, I believe. They are slated to host New Hampshire at home. And so women's hockey, they've had a tough go of things so far, 2-5 on the season. They've actually had to deal with some postponement, of their own thus far. But as of right now, they seem to be looking forward to that matchup tomorrow night, and then they will travel to Vermont January 1st and 2nd for a matchup with the Catamounts. And real quick, we also have a basketball update, albeit slightly less consequential. Men's and women's basketball, they were slated to tip off January 2nd against Boston University. However, due to some testing protocols and just the timeline of testing on the part of Boston University, those matchups are going to be pushed back just a couple more days. And so men's basketball and women's basketball, they will begin their home-and-home series with the Terriers on Monday, January 4th, and then Tuesday, January 5th. And so that will begin the first of many matchups between these two programs over the next couple months. As we talked about in the past, BU and Holy Cross will be very familiar with each other by season's end.
Absolutely. And before we move on to the NBA season, I will say I really do sympathize with a lot of these athletes. I'm sure this off-season was much more difficult than off-seasons past, just in terms of following protocol and getting together with your teammates and finding the time to practice, well enough to be prepared for these games, but remaining safe at the same time. I'm sure weeks, if not months, went into this kind of preparation, and to have it come to a halt and perhaps be postponed indefinitely is, I'm sure, very difficult for a lot of these student athletes. They put in so much time and effort into their athletics as well as academics. So prayers to them. Hopefully they can get their season kicked off. I'm sure you feel the same way, Aidan. I know how much you want to get back to campus and start calling these Holy Cross basketball games, but for the time being, I guess they have to be a little more patient. And since we're going on month 11 of this pandemic, I'm sure patience has run out for a lot of people. But that's the situation right now, and we hope for the best for a lot of these programs.
Definitely, Rob. And so just because we do have some sports that are going on with relatively few postponements right now, let's get into the NBA. Specifically, you and I wanted to briefly run down our Christmas Day recap, as well as talk about some of the top performers and disappointments from early on in the season. So I'll be the first to say that, Christmas basketball, like I mentioned in last week's podcast, it's always been a very special thing to me. Just having that first game tip off at noon every single year. I remember even in the 2011-2012 lockout season, the very first game, the NBA season that is, tipped off at noon on Christmas. And so even in the midst of a pandemic, it's something that I still had to look forward to Christmas morning. And so this year that marked a 111-98 victory by the Miami Heat over the New Orleans Pelicans. Arguably, it ended up being one of the more compelling matchups of the entire day, with the possible exception of the late game, Clippers-Nuggets. But it was really nice seeing Zion Williamson, Brandon Ingram run up against the Miami Heat, obviously coming off their finals run. It was just really nice to see Miami receive sort of the credit they deserved for their deep postseason push. Jimmy Butler, he was playing well, unfortunately suffered what I believe to be a minor ankle injury early on in the second half. But it was nice. The Heat were led by Duncan Robinson. He put up 23 points on 7 of 13 shooting from 3. So Duncan Robinson had himself a day, and I don't know, it was probably my favorite matchup of the day. Obviously, the Celtics later on got trounced, but did you have a chance to catch any of the action on Christmas?
I did. I caught most of this game you were just talking about, New Orleans at Miami. I took the same impressions. Duncan Robinson is not just a guy who can sit in the corner, post up, and get open for three. He's a guy who'll create his own space and drain some of these long-range shots. And I dare say he's perhaps the most dangerous perimeter shooter, not pure scorer because I don't think that's his game, but the best spot-up perimeter shooter since perhaps Klay Thompson, Steph Curry entered the league. His precision is unbelievable from behind the arc. He's such a threat when he has the ball in his hands. And look, what I saw from Miami, I know it's early and we're going to have a lot of overreactions to these first three games as we talk about them, but I think the floor for Miami remains the same as it was last year, around that 4th or 5th seed. But the ceiling, I think, if guys like Robinson are playing the way they are and continue to develop, can be as high as 2. The matter of fact is the NBA is a three-point league now, and teams who can shoot the three ball really well are going to succeed no matter what. And the more games that guys like Tyler Hero and Duncan Robinson and Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo have under their belts, the better they're going to get. And it looks like they're carrying their momentum that they had from their great finals run the year before into this season. And I'll be excited to see how they play the rest of the way. I saw that game, and then I also caught a little bit of the Milwaukee Bucks and the Golden State Warriors. Like most of the Christmas games that day, not too exciting. Steph Curry had an off night. Chris Middleton had a nice 30-point performance. Golden State, obviously not off to the best start this year, but it was basketball nonetheless on Christmas. And one game I did want to get your opinion on, Aidan, you mentioned earlier, was the Nets and the Celtics. I think this had the potential to be the best game billed on Christmas Day. And it turned out to be not much of a contest, especially getting into the late second half. Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving combining for 66 points that night. I think they really sent a message to the rest of the league that they are here to stay in the East, and they could be a formidable opponent to teams like the Lakers and the Clippers in the finals.
Yeah, definitely, Rob. I caught just a little bit of that game. I actually, unfortunately, had to turn off my TV before things started getting out of hand. And I guess in retrospect, I'm glad that that was the case, as the Celtics put forth really 2.5 good quarters of basketball. But then the Nets just started blowing the doors off the Celtics. You mentioned Kyrie and KD absolutely heated up, combining for 66. And then how about the Brooklyn bench? I think this is going to be the story that we continue to watch over the season. And unfortunately, even after Christmas, we just received news that Spencer Dinwiddie has a partially torn ACL and will likely miss the remainder of this season. And you and I can talk about that. I think in some ways he is superfluous for this Brooklyn Nets offense, given the likes of Karis LeVert and others. I think that he is easily replaceable. But at the same time, it's definitely now you're in a situation where you're one injury away, or even worse, one COVID case away from potentially having to really struggle to fill out your bench and your rotation. But the Nets, it all starts with KD and Kyrie. I don't think you can disagree with that. I was especially impressed also with their center rotation. I think that Jarrett Allen, he's a young player. He's sacrificing a lot coming off the bench for an established veteran in DeAndre Jordan. But, they're players with similar skill sets. I think that they're both really interior anchors. They sort of don't need to get too many looks on offense. They really create a lot of their points on putbacks, and really they can both play the pick and roll moderately well. So I was impressed with Brooklyn. I think that they are going to be potentially the team to beat, along with the Milwaukee Bucks, and competing for a 1 seed up in the Eastern Conference. And meanwhile, for the Celtics, I think that now sitting on 1-2 for the season, they could easily be 2-1. They just dropped an ugly one against the Indiana Pacers the other night, and they play them again tonight, Tuesday night. I think that Jaylen Brown, he's really the only player on Christmas that showed up for the Celtics in a meaningful way in terms of their star players, and he's done so throughout the first 3 games of the season. And I know that Jason Tatum, he warrants a lot of the media attention and fan attention just because of his offensive heroics, but sometimes I just find myself thinking that maybe Jaylen Brown, though he may have the lower ceiling, you sort of know what you're going to get from him on any given night at this point. He was a 20-a-game scorer in just his 4th year in the league. And really, he's been a pleasure to watch. He's my favorite player in the NBA, and I've been nothing but impressed with Jaylen Brown early on.
Yeah, talk about maturation from, where he was his rookie year to where he is now. I mean, he's become a star on that team, and I think one of the more underappreciated players in the NBA, considering how he's brought that Celtics team to the top of the East, along with, of course, Jason Tatum, Kemba Walker, and the rest of their teammates. And if we recap the rest of the NBA action on Christmas Day, we got to see a little bit of Western Conference action later in the night with the Clippers and the Nuggets playing, as well as the Lakers and the Dallas Mavericks. The biggest takeaway from those 2 games, even though I didn't watch them, was, for me, the Lakers can now boast themselves as a deep team. I think last season you saw a lot of LeBron and Anthony Davis, and that proved to be more than enough to get them a title. But now that they have a solid bench, especially in a season with COVID, they can withstand some of these stoppages or postponements that they might face along the way. Maybe unlike a team like the Brooklyn Nets, who might need to dive deeper into their bench to fill out those bench spots. So Lakers very impressive 23-point win over the Mavericks. The Clippers getting a 13-point win over Denver. Denver is 1-2 now. The Lakers are 2-2. Not the starts you would expect from the Western Conference finalists of last season. I'm going to say it's very early, but let's talk about some of the disappointing starts, player-wise and team-wise, in the NBA. I'll kick it off to you to start.
I think you definitely have to start with the Golden State Warriors, not necessarily disappointing in the sense of underachieving at this point. We knew that things were going to be hard, especially out of the gate, missing Klay Thompson. And now we find that one of their key rotation players, he actually just broke his leg. It wasn't Looney, it was, what's his name? I'm struggling to think of his name for whatever reason right now, but one of their bigs, he actually suffered a fractured tibia, I believe it was. So that's one more piece, and it's going to mean more minutes for James Wiseman moving forward. But Steph Curry, it's sort of an interesting stat. He always struggled on Christmas Day. I don't think he's ever crossed the 20-point threshold on Christmas Day games, and this year was no different. I think... Who was it?
Marquise Chris.
Oh, Marquise Chris. Yeah, I should have thought of that. He was a high draft pick a couple years ago who's really struggled to materialize as a big-time NBA player. But Steph Curry, it's like we're seeing him. It's like we're in a time machine, and this is circa 2013 when he is being asked once again to carry an offensive team. And, I think it's definitely going to be a transitional period for him. He's established himself as a player who's capable of doing so, but he hasn't done that in 6 years. He's had Klay Thompson. Andre Iguodala, Kevin Durant, and even Draymond Green, who's not yet played this season for the Warriors. I think once Draymond comes back, they're going to have a lot better offensive spacing and movement. I think players like Kelly Oubre and Andrew Wiggins are guys that have been absolutely awful to start the season, but are going to get a lot better once Draymond does suit up for the Warriors. But yeah, I think once again, it's disappointing, not so much from their underachievement per se, but I guess more or less from a fan's perspective. You just wish that this could be the Golden State Warriors 2.0 or 3.0, I should say.
Yeah, you're right about Draymond Green coming back and how big he's going to be. The Warriors are dead last in the league in opponents' points per game. They're giving up 130 points per game through their first three. And you bring up a good point about Curry as well. I think even though we're not expecting Golden State to be the contenders they once were, I think this season in particular may be the most important for Steph Curry's legacy. Last year, they were banged up. He didn't even play the majority of the season. I think he played 4 or 5 games. So you can draw a clean slate for this year. Now Steph Curry is going to have to lead this team who I think will really struggle now and in the middle of the season without Klay Thompson. And we're going to have to ask ourselves, is Steph Curry really in this upper echelon of all-time players when he doesn't have the talent like Klay Thompson and Kevin Durant surrounding him? I think it's going to be really interesting. I think Steph Curry's got it in him to for sure lead the Warriors to the playoffs. I see their ceiling, though, is maybe a 7 or 6 seed because the West is loaded. You have the Clippers, Suns, Jazz. Portland could be hanging around that 8th spot. New Orleans as well. You have the Lakers, the Mavericks, the Grizzlies with Ja Morant playing so well, although he just got injured, so we'll see how that situation with him unfolds. But it's going to be an uphill battle for Steph and the Warriors in the 2021 season. But let's talk about some top performers from these past few games. James Harden picking up right where he left off. Perhaps not the best performance as a teammate per se, given recent events, but he's averaging 39 points per game over his last 2. He's no stranger to scoring the ball. Trae Young, perhaps staking his claim as a dark horse MVP candidate. Really strong performance to open the season. And Terry Rozier, not only on the stat sheet, but on the highlight reel, making a name for himself, throwing one down over Kevin Durant. I don't know if you saw that one, Aidan, but it made me jump out of my chair when I was watching it.
Kevin Durant, actually, interestingly, he's been nothing but short of remarkable to start the season. He has been dunked on 3 times in 3 games thus far. There was the Rozier one. There was Kelly Oubre opening night on the putback dunk, and I'm struggling to remember who got him from the Celtics. But yeah, I think that absolutely Terry Rozier, he's been on a tear with that 40-point outing. But how about his buddy Gordon Hayward straight out of Boston? Those two obviously spent some time together, even though Hayward was injured through much of Rozier's first season, or rather through his first season with the team. They didn't coexist, and that's when Rozier led the Celtics on that deep postseason run without Kyrie, without Hayward. But Gordon Hayward through 3 games, averaging 22.7 a game, including 2 28-point performances, one of which actually just came against the Brooklyn Nets. In a victory, Hayward led the team in scoring and put up 28, 6, and 7. And I think it's so interesting, just the narrative on Gordon Hayward. I think that he's not going to be an all-star. I would be shocked if he were an all-star. But just how Boston fans and sports fans turned on Gordon Hayward throughout the past year and a half, really. Obviously, he had the devastating injury. We all know what happened opening night against the Cavs, 2017, 2018. But he's just had a lot of sort of knick-knack weird injuries since then, a lot of like hand, wrist, like weird things other than the ankle. He aggravated in the Orlando bubble and missed most of the Celtics postseason run, but he's always had game. And we saw this from Hayward a year ago. He really came out of the gates on fire for the Celtics at the beginning of 2019-2020, and then that's just when he broke a finger, or maybe it was his hand, and was never really the same since. But you almost get the feeling that it was more of sort of just a logjam in Boston rather than any real shortcoming on Hayward's part. And I think we're starting to see that right now. He made a brilliant decision for his career, frankly, in heading to the Charlotte Hornets, where he secured a $200 million contract. He had the chance to now be the focal point of an offense, and I think that he's really going to thrive in his new scenery in Charlotte, and we're seeing that thus far.
Yeah, he seems to be backing up his decision. 2 28-point outings in the first 3 games, and uh, Hayward provides a nice little transition into the next topic. Impressive teams to start out the gate. Obviously, Charlotte had an impressive win against the Brooklyn Nets. They still sit at 1-2. They'll likely be at the basement of the Eastern Conference. But teams that were thought to be at the bottom of the East that are really surprising all of us, the Cleveland Cavaliers, the Orlando Magic, the Atlanta Hawks, all 3-0 to start the season. And I'd like to ask you, Aidan, is this a mirage? Is this, a hot start in a weird season burdened by the pandemic, or do teams like the Cavs and the Magic and the Hawks really have some standing power? I think Atlanta has a shot to make the playoffs. They did a lot to improve this offseason. They picked up Gallinari. Trae Young is poised to have his best season yet. They have a lot of great young players like John Collins, Kent Bazemore in the ranks too. And in a weak Eastern Conference, I think they have a chance to make some noise and sneak in, especially in this expanded field. But with the team like the Cavs, I think they've just caught lightning in a bottle these past 3 games. I don't see much talent on that team to get me really excited. They still have a long ways to go in developing a lot of high draft picks they've had over the last few seasons.
You know what? The thing with Cleveland is I think their roster is garbage, but I will say their young backcourt, they're turning some heads right now. Colin Sexton, Darius Garland, they are, or Sexland as Larry Nance likes to call them. They've been really great thus far and led the team to that 3-0 record. And I think that they definitely, as a backcourt, they have some promise moving forward. But I think that Cleveland needs to move on from the likes of Kevin Love. Larry Nance, he's a veteran player who really should be competing for a championship level team at this point in his career. So Andre Drummond also, I'm not quite sure what he's doing in Cleveland. He obviously has maybe a immovable contract, but yeah, I don't love Cleveland in terms of being a playoff team. I also frankly don't like Orlando as more than potentially a play-in seed or maybe a 7 seed once again. I will, however, say that Atlanta, and let me just preface this by saying that this Atlanta experiment could go terribly, terribly wrong, because I think that you have a couple different alpha dogs on that team between Trae Young, and then they brought in Rondo off the bench. So once the playoffs roll around and if Atlanta's in the picture, I wonder how playoff Rondo is necessarily going to thrive in a backup role behind Trae Young. But in addition to Gallinari, they also brought in Bogdan Bogdanovic, and so now you're in a situation where you are surrounding a playmaker like Trae Young and Rajon Rondo. You're just surrounding them with shooters, and I think that that's a recipe for success. They also have Cam Reddish. He's obviously supposed to be a knockdown guy. Even their bigs, such as John Collins, I think he shot nearly 40% from 3 a year ago. And so this Atlanta thing, it could go one of 2 ways. They could surprise everyone, end up maybe a 5 or 6 seed, or Rondo and Trae Young could start fighting in the locker room, and suddenly you're the 12 seed with 10 games to go. So I like what they did this offseason, though. I think that shows a lot of potential. And Rob, will say one more thing in terms of teams that are sitting at 3-0. They're all in the Eastern Conference right now. We mentioned the Cavs, Magic, and the Hawks. But one team that I've been impressed by is the Indiana Pacers. And I feel like we have this conversation every year that the Pacers are an underrated team. And I think that's true this year more than ever. Finally, they have a healthy Victor Oladipo, who obviously he's not quite the same as he used to be, but don't look at Victor Oladipo as a scrub by any means. They have an incredibly talented front court between Miles Turner and Domantas Sabonis, although a lot of people rightfully wonder whether those two can coexist. I'm one of those people. But then the play of Malcolm Brogdon also. I've always been a huge Malcolm Brogdon fan. He's a big point guard who can really get it done defensively and is an absolutely incredible shooter. He's toyed with the 50-40-90 club in the past. So they just beat my Celtics the other night, but I didn't even mention TJ Warren, right? He had his own bubble explosion several months ago. So I think Indiana, they're not necessarily a very deep team when you look beyond players like Holiday, Doug McDermott, just to name a couple. But they're a team that absolutely they should be a postseason contender, or to make the playoffs, not necessarily compete for a series victory. But I think they're legit, and I think they're a team we should keep an eye on for these next few months.
I agree, and I see the same sort of thing in the Pacers. Very resourceful front office, great coaching staff. They can really get all they can out of their players, and they might not have the biggest budget, the biggest names, but they're at the top of the East, at the top of the league, and I still think a lot of people believe in them. I was one of those people last season in the bubble saying, look out for the Pacers, even without Oladipo. They've proven their weight. They've gotten here without him. They can certainly get through a round or two without him. I predicted them to win in 7 against the Miami Heat. That, of course, didn't happen. The Heat swept them and went on to the NBA Finals. But I like the Pacers, really well-run organization, underdog team. They remind me a lot of the San Antonio Spurs without the championship pedigree in terms of how they're run, how they can maximize talent across the floor. But let's talk about some disappointing teams to start the year, Aidan. And disappointing can be kind of a strong word when the Lakers have played 4 games, and that's the most anyone's played this season, along with the Nets at 2-2 as well. But I'll start with my Chicago Bulls. I know we're not expecting them to be any semblance of a playoff team or any semblance of a competitive team, but they've looked especially bad across these 3 games. I'll go as far as saying the worst team in the league across their first 3. ESPN's power rankings had them dead last. They're giving up 126 points a game, which is second worst, only behind the Warriors, who they lost to on a Damian Lee game-winning shot. Zach LaVine looks good. Kobe White looks good, looks willing to take shots, which I like, but they're not really scoring the ball too efficiently. They've been hucking up a lot of shots that aren't going in the net, and defensively, they're an absolute mess. I know Billy Donovan isn't known for his lockdown defense, so to speak, but you got to do better than 126 points per game against teams like the Hawks and the Warriors and the Detroit Pistons. Excuse me, not the Pistons, the Charlotte Hornets of all teams. But yeah, it's been a sad start. It certainly doesn't give me hope for this season. I know we talked about it last episode, my expectations for the Bulls and my hopes for them having somewhat of a solid season given their young core, but things seem to be going downhill pretty quickly. Do I have reason to panic at all with this team?
No, I don't think necessarily. I think that maybe we're still going to end up getting the team that we thought we would at the beginning of the season. I don't know. I actually have not watched a minute of Bulls basketball thus far this season.
I don't blame you.
Yeah. Wendell Carter, I've talked about him in the past. He put up a 20-10-5 at least performance the other night. So obviously their young guys are going to get theirs, I think. It's more a matter of it's going to take a while for these players under a new coaching regime to put together really any sort of cohesion. And as I talked about in the past also, I just hate their bench. I don't think that they have too much going on between Satoransky, Thad Young, and others who have had their moments, but I don't think that they're going to make too much. So that said, I don't think they're going to go 0-72, but I don't think they're going to go 69-3 either in this shortened season. So I would expect them to continually improve and maybe be around that 10 or 11 spot in the Eastern Conference, I think.
That is fair. Another team I'd actually like to talk about who've been somewhat of a disappointment so far. The Houston Rockets are sitting at 0-2. This was kind of predictable given how crazy the start of their season was with all the drama with James Harden and the COVID cases. Do you think there is a surprise playoff exit, or not even a playoff exit, but a playoff absence for the Houston Rockets, given the way they started? I mean, James Harden might not even be on the team in a few weeks the way things are going. We could see him get traded to a team like Philadelphia or Brooklyn is another suitor he's pointed out. What do you think of the Houston Rockets and their path moving forward?
Yeah, I don't think it's only going to be a Houston Rockets playoff absence. I think it's going to be a James Harden absence, unfortunately. I was one of those people that was like, okay, let's give this a little bit of time and see what happens. Maybe Harden decides he wants to stay, and maybe he likes playing with John Wall. Not that John Wall is actually been able to play a game, as he and DeMarcus Cousins have had to sit out thus far due to COVID protocols that I believe are unrelated to James Harden, according to reports. But yeah, James Harden, he's a frustrating player in that he can be out away from the team. Maybe the partying has been a little bit overstated in the media, but he comes away from this absence when he was in Vegas, and his first game puts up 44, 17, and 4. And it was in a 128-126 loss to a Portland Trailblazers team that I think Houston on paper should be better than. Maybe they need all of their guys, but Christian Wood, he's put together a couple 30-point outings already for the Rockets, I think. I think that the supporting cast, I'm not sure why the media flipped on them, but they still have PJ Tucker. They still have these guys that have been there in playoff moments. They don't have Robert Covington. And as mentioned, obviously, the jury's still out on whether Wall or Cousins can meaningfully contribute. But it's just frustrating to see James Harden. I'm almost at a point where maybe I sort of think Harden wants to lose with his team and put up his numbers and see the media narrative shift to him to a point where it's like, why is Harden wasting his prime years in Houston? I think that would be a win-win for James Harden, seeing as he reportedly wants out of Houston already. It's just a matter of, I think, fewer and fewer teams, for whatever reason, are willing to bite on James Harden. There was a lot of smoke, but not necessarily any fire when it came to Brooklyn or when it came to Denver and Boston even. Boston's interesting, as so many Boston players have been outspoken, even to the media, in saying they don't want a James Harden in the locker room or on the court for that matter. So 0-2, I think that Houston, obviously they're better than 0-2. They should, by all means, be in the playoff hunt, in the playoff picture. But really all of this is dependent on how long James Harden is a Houston Rocket and whether John Wall can really do too much as a member of that franchise.
I agree. And before we move on to the NFL, we'll talk about one recently maligned player in the media, just one more, and that's Paul George. The Clippers, I'm surprised we haven't talked about this yet, suffering a 51-point loss to the Dallas Mavericks a couple days ago. They found themselves in the biggest halftime deficit in NBA history. I believe that was 53 points. And they did it all without Kawhi Leonard, who had been banged up from the previous game. And in Kawhi's absence, Paul George only put up 15 points, continuing another really sloppy stretch of games to start the season. And this picks right up from where he played in the bubble, which was a very lackluster performance, especially for a guy like Paul George and the career he's had so far. And it's brought some people to wonder, including myself, are the Clippers still built for championship basketball if Paul George simply cannot pull his weight any longer? We're already seeing talks of, trade Paul George, bring someone else in. I think that's a little premature. He's been a very established player on the offensive and defensive sides of the ball, but you start to wonder, at a cold streak that persists for this long, and who knows when it's going to end, is it getting to be kind of a mental problem for Paul George as opposed to a physical one? We know he has the talent. He's a great three-point shooter when he's on, all NBA defensive player when, he's focused in the game. But is this recent wave of criticism that spans back to the beginning of the bubble justified? And is it contributing to his play? Because the Clippers certainly need him to match up against teams like the Lakers and the Mavericks and the Utah Jazz and the Nuggets. But he isn't bringing that at all yet. And since the Clippers lost Montrezl Harrell in the offseason, they retooled a little bit, but I'd argue they're not as solid as they were the year before. Are they in trouble in terms of competing for that Western Conference title?
I just don't think they can be in trouble, Rob. I'm not a huge fan of some of the things they did this offseason. I think the Luke Kennard contract was ridiculous. I think even the Marcus Morris contracts, it was something like $64 million for 4 years, and I understand they had to pay that to keep him. But one of the moves they made this offseason that I actually really liked, they unfortunately lost one of their best guys in Montrezl Harrell, but they brought in Serge Ibaka, who I think makes a ton of sense for that team. He previously won a championship alongside Kawhi Leonard in Toronto. But just in terms of getting back to Paul George and where he is in terms of the media attention that he's deserving or undeserving of, I love Paul George, but at the same time, I'm getting real tired of defending him because it's not so much that really he deserves everything that he's getting, because let's not forget, we're literally 1 week removed from opening night, Lakers Clippers. It's the ring night for the Lakers, and Paul George puts up 33, 6, and 3 assists. He shot 13 of 18 from the field. And really, we were talking about, like, you know, PG is back. They don't have to worry. Like, obviously, pandemic P is not necessarily over, nor is the pandemic itself. But I think that a lot of the negative attention is coming from his post game statements and what he's saying to the media. I think that if he thinks that he's being treated unfairly, he needs to check himself, because after that 51-point loss, he said, and I quote, "It's no big deal." Because really, a 51-point loss and the largest halftime deficit in NBA history, even if you are missing Kawhi Leonard, your best player, it's not like the Mavs are the Golden State Warriors of years past, right? They didn't even have Kristaps Porzingis, who's going to be out or on the shelf for at least a couple of months. You had Luka Doncic and, a decent supporting cast, but nothing special. And in a head-to-head matchup, if I'm Paul George, I would think that I could carry a team to a victory over Luka, who hasn't won a playoff series, and a bunch of role players. And to say that it's not a big deal, which by the way is exactly what he said more or less following the Clippers' exit from the postseason a year ago. I think that definitely a lot of the negative attention Paul George is receiving right now, it's extremely overstated, but at the same time, I can't even defend it anymore.
Yeah, I'm sure frustrations are building with George's defenders. To his credit, he started the season pretty strong. Obviously, you mentioned the 33-point outing. He dropped 23 in a win against the Denver Nuggets, where he shot 5 of 9 from outside the arc. But yeah, you're right. He was abysmal against Dallas, 0 for 6 from 3, only 15 points, 4 turnovers. So I think we're just going to have to see more consistency out of Paul George playing at the level he's expected to play at, because I repeat, if he can't step up and provide what he was signed to do for the Los Angeles Clippers, I think it's another inside track for the Lakers to run away with the West and compete for LeBron's 5th championship.
Definitely, Robin. One thing I'll say just before we get to the NFL, obviously we could include this with our fumbles, but we won't. We'll spare him the embarrassment. Kelly Oubre, Golden State Warriors. First 3 games of the season, he is 0 for 31 on non-dunk attempts, including one of the worst starts in history from beyond the arc. So Kelly Oubre, if you want your Golden State Warriors to turn things around, you got to do a little bit better than 0 for 31 on non-dunks.
Absolutely. I think I could find guys at my local YMCA who'd have better luck thus far than Kelly Oubre, but
You've Kerr pick me up.
that is neither here nor there. Let's move on to weeks 16 and 17 of the NFL season. Aidan, we're getting down to the wire in the National Football League. Only one team knows thus far exactly where they'll be and what they'll be doing next week, and that is the defending champs, Kansas City Chiefs, whose next flight may not be until February to Tampa for the Super Bowl. They've clinched home field with a fourth quarter comeback win against who else but the Atlanta Falcons, blowing another fourth quarter lead. This time it was on the road, so switching things up, but the Chiefs getting away with a tight win, 17-14 against Atlanta. You have your Buffalo Bills, Aidan, dismantling the New England Patriots on Monday Night Football, 38-9. Josh Allen with another MVP-esque performance, throwing 3 touchdowns to Stephon Diggs. The Bills can clinch the number 2 seed if they win next week, hosting the Miami Dolphins, or if the Pittsburgh Steelers, who got back on track with a win last week against the Colts, lose their game against the Browns. And thus far, Aidan, we have the Chiefs, Bills, and Steelers locked into the playoffs for the 2020 season. There's still some seeding questions to be answered with the Bills and Steelers, like I mentioned. If the Steelers win and the Bills lose, the Steelers can leapfrog into that number 2 spot. But we have 5 teams, the Titans, Dolphins, Ravens, Browns, and Colts, all fighting for 4 final playoff spots in this expanded field. And even with 7 teams now as opposed to 6, you're still going to see a 10-win AFC team fail to make the postseason, with all of these teams that I just mentioned sitting at 10-5. on the year. You have the Titans with the inside track right now as the AFC South leader and the holder of some of these important tiebreakers, and their division rival, the Colts, currently on the outside looking in that eighth spot, needing a win in Week 17 against the Jacksonville Jaguars, as well as one of those other four teams to lose their Week 17 game. So a lot of excitement. This is one of my favorite times of the year as a sports fan, and I think this is why so many people are drawn to the NFL now, as opposed to some other sports. Every game seems like it matters so much, even in the regular season. We basically have a play-in game for so many of these teams into the postseason, and it's a really exciting time of year.
Yeah, definitely. I think Week 17 of the NFL, as crazy as this season has been, this is one of the better Week 17 scenarios across the league we've really seen in quite a few years now. I was trying to wrap my head around just all of the seeding scenarios, and I know sort of near the top of the standings we have a couple of matchups or a couple of spots already locked up, but really the rest of the field, it's wide open, especially just the wildness that is the AFC standings at this point. One thing I will say, you talked about Pittsburgh just briefly and it's just where they could end up after Week 17. I'm going to push back a little bit and just say it really doesn't matter where Pittsburgh ends up in the standings. And I know that seems like a weird statement. They're a team that really could use the benefits of a home field throughout the first couple rounds, just because of where they've been at the start of the season relative to where they are right now. But I think that if you look at that decline, I think that a lot of that just says that they, it all starts with Roethlisberger, who really he struggled, but then Week 16 we saw him put forth one of his best performances really over the past maybe couple of years of his career. It looked like 2010 all over again, just some of the plays he was making. But I think that they're a team that could easily beat anyone or lose to anyone in that AFC, and that's why I'm saying that it really just does not matter where they end up. They're not the team that we thought we would have, or that we even frankly want to have, just given some of their antics and unprofessionalism and just disappointment on the field, most importantly. But yeah, just in terms of Chiefs, Bills, I think it's starting to look more like a 1A and 1B type scenario, as opposed to the Chiefs being necessarily the team to beat. But I think that it's going to be fun to watch. Tennessee, they've disappointed over the past several weeks, but Miami, they're dealing with their own sort of issues in terms of deciding what quarterback they want to roll with. I know they like a Tua, but then Fitzpatrick, he obviously fits maybe their needs right now in terms of securing that postseason berth. It's going to be a lot of fun to watch, and obviously a lot of people are rightfully high on the Baltimore Ravens right now, who were sort of a preseason favorite, sort of hit a slump, but I think they've won maybe their last 4 matchups or so, and a lot of people are buying stock in the Baltimore Ravens. One stat I encountered in terms of Baltimore, they're on track right now to lead the NFL in point differential for the second straight year, which is something that no team has done in just about 25 years, I want to say. They led the league in point differential a year ago. So the Baltimore Ravens are a team obviously led by Lamar Jackson, who's been up and down. But they're a team that you look at, sort of that wild card in a playoff series this year more than ever, that could potentially, really pose a problem to someone, even in this expanded field where you are going to have that team that is a sleeper. That's inevitable.
Absolutely, and I think the Ravens are going to have a chip on their shoulder as opposed to last season where they were 14-2. They had the MVP, Lamar Jackson, and really had all the expectations falling on them. But assuming they finish 11-5, if they can take care of the Bengals next week, they'll likely play the Pittsburgh Steelers, their division rivals, in the first round of the playoffs. And you know the saying, Aidan, it's very difficult to beat the same team twice, and in this case 3 times. Given that the Steelers have won the previous 2 meetings, albeit one of them was without Lamar Jackson. But the Ravens are certainly a dark horse candidate for the AFC representative in the Super Bowl. They're playing their best football right now, arguably the hottest team in the league, with winning their last 4 games. And going back to the Steelers, I think the way you put it was exactly right. They could win any game and lose any game. I thought when they were down 24-7 to the Colts last week, we were seeing more of the same dysfunction, stagnant offense, couldn't move the ball. Big Ben looked like he had cement blocks on in the pocket, couldn't move. His arm looked like it was about to fall off, but all of a sudden they start taking shots down the field. Their defense stiffens up, and they sneak out of their home stadium with a win against a playoff team. So we'll see if they can carry that momentum into the postseason. Ben Roethlisberger won't be starting next week. We found out today they'll be starting Mason Rudolph to give Ben and that offense some rest, which I find a little surprising, Aiden, because, if the Steelers win, not only do they get to knock out their division rival, the Cleveland Browns, which I'm sure would feel very good, but they have a chance to leapfrog the Bills into that second seed if the Bills lose to the Dolphins, who, of course, with Ryan Fitzpatrick now, proved to be a very competitive team. It's a little surprising. It's definitely a conservative call from the Steelers front office resting their best quarterback, but I guess they're prioritizing Big Ben's health over perhaps leapfrogging the Bills and getting a matchup against the AFC's seventh-seeded team in a few weeks.
You wonder if there's some scoreboard watching maybe going on the parts of the Steelers right now, because obviously their next matchup, Week 17, or no, sorry, they just played the Colts. Sorry, I misread that. I thought maybe they were rooting for the Colts to leapfrog the Browns for that last spot in the AFC. But yeah, it's an interesting division. I wonder what goes into it, if it's a matter of not thinking home field is necessarily the advantage it once was. Obviously, a lot of the talk around the NFL this past week and a half has been who plays the best in the snow. And it's like, I'm not sure if you've caught any of that chatter, but I think that it's so over-exaggerated. I don't know that. I'm not someone with a football background or played football in the snow or in the sun growing up, but it's just weird that that's what we're talking about in the midst of such a contentious playoff push for all these teams. We're talking about who plays best in the snow. It's driving me crazy. But yeah, I think that maybe Pittsburgh, I guess they're hoping that maybe if they rest Ben and a couple of their guys, like, they can sort of recenter themselves for their first round matchup. I'm not quite sure all that goes into it, but if anyone could use maybe a recentering, I guess it would be that team in their defense, just in terms of where they were and where they are right now.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Maybe we see on Sunday, if the Bills get down early and they're struggling to come back against Miami, the Steelers put in Big Ben if the game with the Browns is still close, although the Browns are favored by 10 now that Roethlisberger is no longer starting, so you can see how important he still is to that team despite the recent struggles. But let's move on to the NFC, Aiden, where things are a bit more clear in terms of who will be in the playoffs, but not necessarily how the field will shake out. We have the Packers, Saints, and Seahawks all having an opportunity at that number one seed and lone first-round bye in the conference. The Packers, after a dismantling of the Tennessee Titans in the snow, as you mentioned on Sunday Night Football, have the inside lane to the number one seed. All they have to do is beat my Chicago Bears in Chicago, Week 17, to clinch that spot. And the Bears also have something to play with, believe it or not. A win against Green Bay and they're in, or the Cardinals and Kyler Murray losing to the Rams on Sunday also gets the Bears in. If you ask me, would the Bears make the playoffs when they were 5-1? I would have said absolutely. If you asked me if the Bears would have made the playoffs at 5-7 after their 6-game losing streak, I would have said no way. But we talked about it last week. Mitch Trubisky playing the best football of his career, the defense stiffening up a little bit in the last few weeks, and I'm scared because it reminds me of that part from The Office where Michael Scott's he's all excited and he says, "I am ready to get hurt again," and that's exactly how I feel about the Bears. They're playing their best football in a while these past few weeks, but it's against their big brother, the Packers, a team who always seems to beat them in the biggest games. We got destroyed on Sunday Night Football a few weeks ago to them. There was a game a few years ago, I want to say maybe the 2014 season, where it was the Packers and the Bears in the last game of the season. The winner won the division, and the Packers had a heartbreaking win over the Bears in Chicago. So I'm very apprehensive about how things are going to go Sunday. I'm cautiously optimistic, but The Bears are 5.5-point underdogs for good reason. The Packers have been playing incredible football. Aaron Rodgers seems to have the MVP locked up already, but check in with me again on Sunday, and I'll let you know how I feel. In the NFC East, the Washington football team, Dallas Cowboys, and New York Giants all still have a chance to win the AFC East, with the best of those teams being 6-9. The Cowboys also 6-9, along with the football team. It's incredible how bad this division is, and how they still managed to send a team to the playoffs. Washington is in with a win. A loss for them leaves the winner of Giants-Cowboys as division champs, whether that'll be a 7-9 Cowboys team or a 6-10 Giants team hosting what will likely be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is really a disgrace to the game, if you want to know the truth. But that's the way things have worked in the NFL this season. And in other news, outside of the playoffs, we had the Jacksonville Jaguars securing the number 1 pick in the 2021 NFL draft, excuse me, with the Jets winning, 2 games in a row in the same season after defeating the Cleveland Browns and taking a detrimental shot at their playoff chances. So give me your own recap of the NFC. And I know you're not as into the NFL as I am, but what do you take from all of this? What are you looking at the most next Sunday in the NFC?
Well, the NFC, I think, interestingly, I'll start with the NFC least, as it's so often called. I think Washington, the football team, they actually have the Sunday night game against the Philadelphia Eagles, and I think that's sort of emblematic of what exactly this conference has been all year, when you have a team that's going to end up being 7-9 and winning the division, most likely. So I think that it's only fitting that Washington, they're playing against Eagles. I think it's going to be a slugfest. I don't think it's going to be pretty whatsoever, but neither is the conference, so that's that. The Cowboys, I think that it's so interesting where they've ended up this season. Between the Prescott injury and now they have a chance to win their division. That is the NFC East once again for you, but at least they have obtained something of a moral victory, if nothing else, through this COVID-ravaged season. Moving on to the NFC West, it's definitely going to be interesting. The Seahawks, they obviously have their playoff position locked in, but it's going to be easy. They've historically really thrived on the 12th man, as so many NFL fans are familiar with, really playing in their home arena. But they are, aside from the 12th man and all that, and really thriving at home, they're peaking at the right time. They're only 4-3 on the road this season, but they have won their last 3 games, and even without their fans, they are 7-1 at home. So they're definitely gonna potentially benefit from having the comforts of home early on. And then I guess NFC North, you mentioned Packers Bears coming up soon. I think I'm actually really looking forward to that matchup, just because Aaron Rodgers, he's doing ridiculous things at 36, 37 years old that we haven't necessarily seen too much of. I agree with you in terms of where he is in the MVP race right now. I think that, maybe the media put a spin on it that maybe nudged him in that direction, but I'm not too mad that that is the case. And in terms of Milwaukee, Chicago, there's a lot of historic sports moments between those two cities. So again, I think it's fitting that these two end up in what could be a nice matchup to determine the fate of both teams, especially the Bears, really. Moving into the playoffs, those cities, they're only 90 minutes away from each other, so I'm definitely looking forward to that one. And then NFC South, after all of this season's turbulence, we do see the Tampa Bay Buccaneers with Tom Brady ending up in that wild card spot. So I think that's a victory for most NFL fans who were sick of seeing him play and dominate in New England, but really appreciated his greatness this late in his career. And then Saints, obviously 11-4. They took care of business this season, led by Drew Brees. They should obviously be proud of themselves. I don't love them as a team to come out of the NFC. I think that it's going to be tough for them to compete with a team like the Packers or even the Seahawks for that matter. But credit to the Saints organization for putting both feet in and really putting themselves in good position for this postseason run.
Yeah, before we move on to our assists and fumbles, I would like to point out that the Saints, for all the struggles they've had this season and for all the questions surrounding their offense, and if Drew Brees can still be the guy in New Orleans and lead them to a Super Bowl one more time before he hangs it up. They played pretty much this entire season without Michael Thomas, the reigning Offensive Player of the Year, a guy who set the receptions record in the NFL last season. He was virtually absent all season long, and that brought us to Alvin Kamara having an equally impressive season. Perhaps he gets his own Offensive Player of the Year this time around. He tied an NFL record for 6 touchdowns on Christmas Day against the Minnesota Vikings, a record held by 3 other players, all of them actually, who were on the Chicago Bears in the pre-Super Bowl era. So Kamara actually did become the first player in the Super Bowl era to score six TDs on Christmas Day. It was a division-clinching win for the Saints and perhaps a fantasy championship-clinching win or performance, should I say, for so many people around the country. Kamara put up, I believe it was 57 fantasy points in a single game, which is just ridiculous at face level. And although I didn't have him on my fantasy team, I did have Mike Evans and Devontae Adams, who combined for a cool 83 points on Sunday and were able to secure that fantasy championship for me. So Bears winning, fantasy team wins, good weekend for me. And check in with me next Tuesday to see how I feel about the Chicago Bears and entering the playoffs.
Yeah, definitely, Rob. Week 17, it is coming, and might as well enjoy it while you can, as the NFL, they could actually add additional weeks to the regular season moving forward. So this could be the last time we see Week 17 discussed as the end-all, be-all for football in terms of postseason positioning. I think there could be a lot of slugfests, a lot of really good matchups, and a lot of scoreboard watching for that matter, as things are so crazy in the standings. So I'm definitely looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Game 7 and Week 17. Some of my favorite words in sports. Aidan, let's kick it off with our assists here. Why don't you go? Tell me how Kevin Love, who you mentioned earlier, is giving back to his community in this season of giving.
Yeah, well, all due respect to Kevin Love, I don't think he should be in Cleveland at this point. He's not producing on the court, but let's not let that take away from what he's doing off of it. As Love recently announced that he intends to cover stadium workers' lost wages from the COVID-19 pandemic. And although the exact amount of his donation was not disclosed, Love previously stated that he intended to donate over $100,000 to workers of Cleveland's Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse. And subsequently joining Kevin Love in this effort were Cavs owner Dan Gilbert alongside his teammate Andre Drummond, who Cleveland acquired from the Detroit Pistons toward the trade deadline last season. So obviously enormous props to Kevin Love. He's been really a model citizen and model teammate for a long time now. He was sort of one of the pioneers in the NBA in terms of advocating for mental health reform for the players, as most, if not all teams, staff a licensed psychologist for players, in large part due to Kevin Love's openness about his struggles with mental health and his efforts in advocating for such. So props to Kevin Love for his work off the court, even if on the court. We actually just found out Kevin Love is going to be out 3 to 4 weeks with a calf injury. So prayers up to Kevin Love that he heals up real soon.
Absolutely. And you said it best. A lot of respect to Kevin Love for coming out and bringing light to an issue that I feel like has become more welcomed, especially in the sports community, since guys like him have talked about their mental health and their struggles being an athlete. You think athletes in this country, they do have very nice lives and make a lot of money, but at the end of the day, they're human too, and they have some of the same problems that everyday people like us deal with as well. And to kind of just ignore those stories simply because they're all rich and famous, I think in some ways does do a disservice to mental health as a whole. So respect to Kevin Love for coming out and saying that, and respect to what he just did this past Christmas. For my assist, I will move on to Browns rookie O-lineman Jedrick Wills. At what he called his winter blast, the offensive tackle surprised a woman in Cleveland with a new car. He paid the rent for a year for a family that lost its home in a house fire, and spread $50,000 worth of toys, gifts, and cash to 5 Cleveland area families. So Jedrick Wills, even with a rookie contract that certainly is not as sizable as some of the higher paid players in the NFL, still in the very much giving spirit this Christmas, providing much needed relief and joy to the families of Cleveland.
Yeah, definitely. Cleveland showing up for both of us in terms of our assists for this week. So
Right.
shout out to the Cleveland community and its athletes. They have a lot of stuff going on the field as well as off the field right now. So as much as maybe we've bashed Cleveland historically, not nearly as much as Atlanta or Georgia sports, but Cleveland's definitely showing up for everyone right now. So moving on to my fumble for this week. This one, there were a lot of things that went wrong this past week in sports, and I wish we could spend half an hour discussing just all the bloopers and fumbles from sports this past week, but one really stood out to me, and that was the Knicks game the other night, as we had a player, Reggie Bullock of the Knicks. He came off the bench for New York, and he was wearing a jersey with the number 25, which is his own number, to his credit, on the front of his jersey, but number 23, Mitchell Robinson, his teammate's number, on the back. So 25 on the front, 23 on the back. And the referees, to their credit, they actually took notice of this and promptly stopped play and shared a laugh with Bullock and Robinson. But yeah, Mitchell Robinson, he had already started the game at center wearing number 23, and the refs noticed something just wasn't right. And it was at that moment that I shut off my television and vowed that I'm not going to watch a second of Knicks basketball for the rest of the year. And I texted as much to one of my close friends who's a Knicks fan. I was like, I'm going to see if the Knicks are watchable this year. They have Julius Randle, who actually has played well, Alfred Payton. I'm going to see if they are really anything, if there's anything there. And really, it was emblematic of the franchise, the ownership, everything. If you can't even put the same number on both sides of a jersey, I'm not quite sure you belong in a professional sports league. And just to say shut up to me, the Knicks went out a night or two later and beat the Milwaukee Bucks 130-110. I wanted to tune into that game because I was shocked, but I couldn't, just because I told myself no more Knicks for this year.
Well, I'm glad you stayed resilient in your promise to yourself. It's very admirable. And in terms of the Knicks, even in their brightest moment thus far this season, of course, it had to get overshadowed by some act of negligence, incompetence, whatever you want to call it. But I do have some Knicks fans as friends who, despite that little mishap, are somewhat hopeful for this season. They're building a young core. They seem to have straightened things out on the ownership end, excluding James Dolan, of course, but coaching-wise, player-wise, front office-wise, they seem to be doing the right things. And, we've mentioned this time and time again, with an expanded playoff, anything can happen. So if the Knicks can keep playing good basketball, hopefully avoid some jersey mishaps, maybe we'll see them in May and June. We'll see.
And Rob, the only thing is, I will just say this just to further blast the Knicks. They've been developing a young core for, it seems like, 5 years now. First it was Frank Ntilikina, then it was Kevin Knox. Turns out both those guys are busts, right? And now it's RJ Barrett, who I actually like. I actually do like RJ Barrett, and it's Obi Toppin. I'm not the biggest Toppin fan in the world, but, we've been hearing Mitchell Robinson, forgot about him. So this young core that they allegedly have been developing for years now, it seems like it keeps shifting to new players, and I think that there's something to be said for that.
Yeah, well, maybe this year is finally the year for the Knicks, although if history is any indicator, that will certainly not be the case. But moving on to my fumble, the Las Vegas Raiders blowing their playoff hopes in a matter of 19 seconds on this past Saturday night against the Miami Dolphins. The Raiders had the ball in the red zone at the end of the game against Miami in a contest that, if they lost, of course, would eliminate them. If they won, would not necessarily improve their playoff chances by a whole lot, considering where they were at that point in the season, but would still give them a fighting chance, no less. They decide to run out the clock, use up all of Miami's timeouts, and kick a field goal down by 2 to get a 1-point lead over Miami. Or a 2-point lead over Miami. They were down by 1 kicking that field goal leaving the Dolphins with 19 seconds on the clock and no timeouts. Seems like a surefire Raiders win, right? Wrong in the hands of Ryan Fitzpatrick, Fitzmagic, as they call him, even as he takes a 15-yard face mask penalty with his helmet literally being ripped off his head almost, as his head is coiled back the other way, completes a 50-something yard pass downfield to his tight end. It's caught. The 15-yard face mask penalty enforced after the catch, setting up the Dolphins for a game-winning field goal as time expires. The Dolphins keep their playoff hopes alive, will likely start Ryan Fitzpatrick next week against the Buffalo Bills if they're smart. I've heard they've been talking about starting Tua again, which I'm not sure how well that bodes for them. But the Las Vegas Raiders are an interesting story. I mean, this was a horrible loss. Blame it on the coaching staff. Blame it on the defense, who's played awful the past few weeks. Blame it on whoever. But in the 3 years of John Gruden's tenure since he became the coach of the Raiders and accepted a 10-year contract, which is something you just never see in any sport, they've started out really well. They're an above-average team in the first month or two of the season, but once you get to November and December, their winning percentage falls to something like 36, 37%, which is a basement-dwelling team. And I think it just raises questions about how the Raiders can perform in big games, and if John Gruden is really a top-level coach that the media portrays him to be. I think a lot about being a coach is having your teams prepared for your biggest games, and the last few years the Raiders have shown to be the exact opposite. So Fumble of the Week goes to Las Vegas. I'm sure there are a lot of fumbles there happening on a weekly occurrence, given the state of that city and what goes on there, but the Raiders certainly aren't doing it any favors with what they did against Miami last week.
Yeah, I think those are all fair worries with regards to the Raiders in terms of where they are as a franchise. I almost feel as though the 10-year contract, it maybe led to a little bit too much confidence in terms of job security and the way things are run within that organization. But just getting back to Raiders-Dolphins, I remember you texted me a few minutes after the play went down and told me to check it out, and I did, and I was like, oh. And then I took a look at the standings, and I was like, oh. That's what's going on. So certainly deserving of your fumble of the week. I can't imagine what was going through the heads of the Raiders in that moment. It's absolutely brutal for a way to go out, even if, as you mentioned, Rob, they had more of a fighting chance to make the playoffs, if anything. Just to see your season end like that, it's completely undesirable and not a great way to end your 2020 at that. So moving on, lastly, to our what to watch for this week, I just wanted to reiterate Holy Cross basketball is tipping off in just under a week now, following the postponement. Holy Cross men's and women's basketball will tip off on Monday, January 4th at and versus Boston University. The men's team are going to start at home, the women's team on the road, and then they'll flip-flop the next day. And as mentioned, this is the first of several matchups between these programs, so those are some games to watch. In terms of players to watch, however, Avery LaBarbera just a day or two ago was named to the preseason Patriot League first team for women's basketball in the Patriot League, so definitely keep an eye on an exciting junior guard for the Crusaders over the next few months. Holy Cross basketball hopefully will be making some noise from both teams, men's and women's, but I think women's basketball, they're a little more well-established at this point, and I'm looking forward to watching them go.
As am I, Aidan. For my what to watch for this week, I'm highlighting a little bit of baseball since we've had quite a while since we've talked about it. The San Diego Padres have made some enormous moves this past week as they acquired the 2018 AL Cy Young Blake Snell from the Tampa Bay Rays, who was surrounded with a fair amount of controversy in the World Series, being that he was pitching so well in Game 6, the Rays fighting to stave off elimination. He was taken out with, I think it was only 73 pitches, which for a top-flight starting pitcher is a little premature. Usually you let him get out there into the 90s and even 100s if he's pitching as well as Snell was that night. So the relationship between him and the Rays was already a little soured, and that was solidified with his trade to the San Diego Padres. And alongside him came right-handed pitcher Yu Darvish from the Chicago Cubs, which gives them what will likely be the strongest rotation in baseball next year and in the years down the line. Darvish had a near NL Cy Young season with the Cubs. This past 2020 season, it was easily the best of his career. If it weren't for Trevor Bauer and the performance he had in 2020, Darvish would have had the Cy Young locked up. But it's going to be a dogfight now in that NL West division between them and the defending champion Dodgers. The Cubs getting a bunch of prospects and pitcher Zach Davies in return. As a Cubs fan, I was really sad to see Yu Darvish go. We've had him for the last 3 years. He's had his ups and downs. He really came into form this past season and was really special. But from a business perspective, I think it was a good deal for the Cubs, if I'm being completely honest. I think Darvish reached his peak value this offseason. I don't think he'll have a season better than the one he had in 2020. And I know this might be a little bit of a reach, but a caveat I'd like to point out is he had his best year in a season where there were no fans. And the past few seasons, he's been labeled as sort of a head case, a guy who can get in his own head. We talked about Paul George, not dealing with criticism perhaps all too well. And Darvish has been on record multiple times saying how much he cares about impressing the fans and living up to their expectations. And in a season without fans in the stadiums, maybe that was the environment for him to clear his head a little bit, focus on his performance, and really turn into something special. So I'm not going to say that's happening from then on. Maybe he made the correct adjustments to become a top-flight pitcher, but he's going to be 35 next season. The Cubs certainly have to get younger and build up their farm system. They have one of the worst in baseball since making all those trades to try to win a World Series back in 2016. So, it's always hard to deal a top-flight player. I'm sure you felt the same way with Kyrie Irving, Aidan, although in terms of Kyrie as a person, maybe you were happy to see him go. But with Yu Darvish, he'll certainly be missed. Brought so much talent to that rotation, but I think the Cubs are closer to retooling than they are to a World Series, and I like the move for them.
Fair enough, Rob. So that for now is going to wrap things up for episode 17 of the WCHC Sports Podcast. It is surely not as exciting as week 17 of the NFL is slated to be this coming Sunday. But that said, we had a blast, and we look forward to keeping things moving full steam ahead for the next several weeks in sports. So for Aidan Rupert and Rob Murray, always a pleasure, and stay tuned for episode 18 in 1 week's time.